Şeriat nedir?
What is Sharia?
The concept of Sharia is amorphous because different people mean different things by it. But in its basic essence and in its philosophical foundations, it is the divine law, meaning including all divine-based normativities. But the confusion that often arises from Sharia is that there are many normative obligations that philosophically, theoretically, theologically are premised upon the will of the divine. But just because the divine wants you for your own good to do X, Y, or Z, it doesn't necessarily mean that other human beings have the right to enforce these obligations on this earth. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the state has the right to enforce these same obligations. Sharia is the sum total of God's will for human beings, one of the basic premises is غرض الشريعة تحقيق مصالح العباد, to achieve the welfare of people, that Allah's will is all premised on what is good for people. But ultimately, it is who has the ultimate authority to decide whether to forgive or to punish, to reward or to not in this earth, in the hereafter. It is God, God's self. The other thing that causes considerable confusion, and especially among, I think, contemporary Muslims, is that quite often we know what God's normative obligations are, what God's will is, through dala'il, through indicators, pieces of evidence. Now, we know that the dala'il could be dala'il aqliya and dala'il naqliya. It could be textual and it could be rational. And we know that all the dala'il are premised on masalih al-ibad, what is good for human beings. All of that is in the realm of philosophy or legal theory in Islam. Okay. But there are many issues in which Allah did not make the dala'il point one way, in which the divine evidence and indicators can create plausibly, legitimately, rationally, create different opinions on the same matter. And on these issues, a lot of Muslims struggle with the idea that on these types of issues, that in fact what Allah's will is that you search for what is good, what is hasan, what is ma'ruf, what is good, what is beautiful, not necessarily the specific conclusion, but the search for the conclusion. And that is why there has always been different madhahib, there has always been the theology of ikhtilaf, of disagreement and diversity in the Islamic tradition. That is also why Muslim jurists would talk about, discuss God's will, and it often to them, it didn't matter whether the state is enforcing the law or not enforcing the law. because ultimately what they're discoursing on, it is left to ضمير المتكلم, the conscience of the receiver, and even the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which there are two disputants, and one of them is more eloquent than the other, and he rules in favor of the more eloquent one. And then the one that was ruled against comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, I swear by God, I was right, but this man spoke more eloquently than me. And the Prophet ﷺ calls back the party who won and the party who lost, and said, by God, be aware that my judgment in your favor will avail you nothing on the hereafter. And so it all goes back to the conscience of the Muslim. And even if the state, a wrong command, an unlawful command by the state, will not vindicate you from liability in the hereafter. So there's a world of difference between the state and the normative commands that are addressed to the conscience of the individual Muslim. In a nutshell, that is Sharia. It is supposed to be the path to divinity, which I always have argued that the path to divinity is also the path to beauty and goodness. That it is an incoherent to say that what is paralleled with the divine can be ugly or not good.
Demokrasi İslam'a aykırı mıdır? Bir İslam devleti kurulmalı mıdır?
Is democracy against Islam? Should an Islamic state be established?
No, I think personally, I think that what is clearly against Islam is despotism. Al-istibdad, shirk. I believe that istibdad is truly shirk. The whole idea is that the whole excitement about the early message of Islam is that تخرج العباد من عبادة العباد لعبادة رب العباد, that you, instead of being a slave to vis-a-vis other human beings, you're a slave to God. And it meant that because you're a slave to God, you cannot be enslaved by any other human beings. And that paradigm is impossible to achieve with despotism. Despotism, I believe despotism is from shaitan. It's clearly demonic because it opens the door to corruption. It opens the door to hypocrisy. It teaches people to be cowardly, to be uncreative, to be lazy, to be apathetic, to be unintelligent. It makes people distrust institutions of learning and knowledge. It just, the amount of social ailments that result from despotism, and especially that human consciousness develops, and the more literacy spreads among the people, the more despotism becomes lethal to them, because education allows for people to have a sense of their own individual aspirations, their own individual trajectory in life. And then despotism comes and says, it's not equal. There's a clique of people that make all the decisions, and you have to accept it. And regardless of how intelligent or how educated or how better you might be, you have to shut up and keep your mouth shut. Now, so the question that the reason I say that is that then the question is, what system can allow me to escape the demonic ailments, shaitani influences of despotism? And, I don't care what you call it, to be quite honest, democracy. The whole idea, the whole idea, the premise of the basic premise of democracy is that there has to be rights that guarantee the dignity and well-being of all, minority and majority. These rights has to be held against the state, so the state is not free to violate these rights. That when it comes to making laws, as long as we don't contravene the rights of the minority, the majority, the laws have to be made in accordance with the will of the majority, because there's no compulsion in religion, and there's no compulsion, la ikrah, and that no one should stay in power forever. There has to be terms, and then this person has to be removed and someone else elected. Now, what in this is un-Islamic? What a lot of people then come and say, well, what if the majority chooses laws that are inconsistent with Sharia? The constitutional foundation of the system can decide, for instance, that as a Muslim ummah, pornography is fundamentally, constitutionally excluded from the realm of possibilities. So even if the majority wants to legalize the pornography, constitutional court would say, no, you can't, because that for us, for in other places, freedom of speech doesn't include the right to solicit the sexual abuse of children, for instance. You don't have a right in the U.S. to advocate the sexual abuse of children. They'll arrest you and put you in prison. In a Muslim country, it could be that the way we draw our limits for freedom of speech is that you can't practice pornography and say, well, this is my freedom of speech. But beyond these limited issues that are constitutionally excluded from deliberation, it is the majority that has to decide on who's in power and what the laws are, even if the majority on many issues decides against the Sharia law, but because there's no compulsion, you can't force them. You can only advocate to them, as long as the rights of the minorities are protected. I actually, at this point in my life, I truly believe that this is the most Islamic, the system most consistent with Islamic theology. We don't, when people say, well, how about alcohol? Well, in the United States, at one point, we had a constitutional amendment that banned alcohol. I mean, and then they needed another constitutional amendment to cancel that ban. I consider alcohol something that can be debated, and ultimately, I can see the matter being constitutionally excluded or not constitutionally excluded. I mean, either way. And if someone says, no, you have to give people the right to sin if they wish to sin, I respect that. I mean, people should have the right. There are things that affect the social welfare of morality, like pornography or prostitution. And on that, it's not that I deny people the right to sin. I'm saying that these are unhealthy for the collective morality of our society. They contravene where we draw the boundaries of modesty and obscenity. But we have to be wise that we only have to take things out of the realm of public deliberations. That has to be the rare exception. It cannot be the rule, because the more issues you take out of the realm of public deliberation, the closer you move to despotism. The more things you leave for the public to debate and deliberate on and decide, the further away you are protecting yourself from despotism. As someone I've lived all my life. Of course, I grew up in Muslim countries and then spent a lifetime studying and observing what despotism I am thoroughly convinced nothing opens up the door to shaitan like dictatorship and despotism. It teaches people to just be through and through munafiqun, through and through hypocrites. And that cannot be blessed. That cannot be Islamic. That cannot be good.